Right, for the third part of this week's lecture, I'm going to very briefly talk about the notion of semiotics as a way of analysing consumer culture. And again, for those that have studied Soccer 1010 in the last year or two, this will be a bit of a refresher from what I was talking about in the lectures and the lecture on consumption in that course. Semiotics is, again, a critical way of unpacking the signs and the texts that are central to consumer culture and pop culture. It's a way of kind of deconstructing the meanings of things beyond their actual use value. And importantly here, it lets us think about the way that consumer culture and consumer products promote not just a way of doing things, like, I don't know, buying a particular shampoo just to keep your hair clean, that there's other meanings embedded into these texts through advertising and through the way these things are produced and promoted that are meant to kind of draw out our kind of desire to connect with others, to be a particular kind of person. So the semiotics kind of analysis here wants to kind of uncover the myths and traditions and symbols that many consumer products are kind of based upon in terms of the way that they're sold to us, and what they're trying to, and the emotions that they're trying to draw out to encourage that form of consumption. But semiotics is also a way of thinking about how we don't always consume ideologically in that sense. We may be drawn towards a product for other reasons other than kind of blind, Adornian kind of notions of consumption. So semiotics wants us to think about how culture is ordered. And it's like a language in that sense that, if you can deconstruct the meanings of words and how they kind of, how the meaning of them are based on, meanings of other words, or how often, the notion of happiness is also being, the word happiness needs to be understood also in conjunction with its opposite, sadness or whatever like that. Semiotics is a way of, where language can be deconstructed like that, semiotics is a way of deconstructing the everyday. It's a way of looking around the world and looking at what are called signs, and thinking about not what just they mean on the surface, but what are the kind of discursive and hidden meanings behind them. Now, a sign here isn't just like, a stop sign. A sign here is pretty much any object that can be analysed. So you can look at a kind of 50-story building as a sign and, look at it semiotically in terms of what it means. Many people would argue that what's being signified there is a phallic object, for instance. So semiotics here wants us to think about the order of the ways that things out in the world construct meaning for us. They're built in a certain way and produced in a certain way. But then it's kind of up to us as consumers to interpret those signs, and there's a kind of negotiation that goes on there. So there's the sign, that's the object itself. There's the signifier, the constitution of the sign. So if it's a building, the constitution of a sign is the bricks and mortar. But then there's the signified, what's the meaning attached to that sign. And from a critical feminist point of view, it might be some kind of phallic and phallocentric object. So in this sense, commodities have meaning, they're encoded with a particular meaning. Particular myths and meanings are built into objects. But then as consumers, we need to decode those meanings, and the way that we decode them will be dependent upon, the kind of person we are, our background, our histories, and who we want to be, and, and how we think we fit into the world. So it's up to individuals then, or groups, to read those myths and meanings that are built into an object. So again, harking back to the first year lecture here, these are kind of good little examples to think about this. There you can see the Lego items that are like, really just a bunch of coloured squares. But, most people in the Western world will look at that and think of The Simpsons. And so here we see a kind of random bunch of coloured blocks. If you can read in that sign, one of the, most important and popular cultural texts of the 20th century. On the next slide there, up the top there, you can see a photo there from, Rocky and Mr. T fighting in, I think, Rocky 2 or Rocky 3 or whatever it was. And the top one there, you see this kind of aggressive masculine confrontation. But if you add a hand to that image down the bottom, it completely changes the meaning and very quickly moves it away from that hegemonic aggressive masculinity into something else. So semiotics here is a way of helping us to understand how, even a slight addition to a photo like that can fundamentally change the way it may or may not be interpreted. Semiotics is a system to help us uncover and to analyse that kind of thing. So Stuart Hall in particular. So Stuart Hall isn't really a kind of one of the genesis of semiotics. It is much earlier, and Roland Barthes in particular is a key theorist in that realm. But I think Stuart Hall's work is particularly good way of thinking through these things. Texts. Now, text here again. Text signs could be a film, a song. It could be a piece of soap or a hairbrush, whatever. It's just kind of anything here in terms of can be read semiotically. So they're produced in a number of ways, right? So there's more closed texts, according to Stuart Hall, where the signs and texts that strongly encourage a particular interpretation. And then there's more open texts that invite a range of interpretations. Importantly, from this Hall's point of view, the production and the way that the texts are, whether closed or open, is important. But what's more important here is the way that consumers read them. And there's numerous ways to decode in that sense. We can read them hegemonically, where we'll just completely kind of absorb the ideological notion of the way that the thing was produced. We can negotiate the reading, where we might partly accept those the dominant interpretation, but we might also negotiate with it as well. There's oppositional or counter-hegemonic readings, where we will reject the ideological underpinnings of a sign. And then there's what's called an aberrant coding, which is kind of reading the sign through a completely different ontological lens, which doesn't really apply to what's going on. So, in particular, I think an example to think about here would be, as I use all the time because it's such a common everyday thing, is something like a pair of Nikes. A dominant hegemonic reading here would be just associating it with being cool or athletic, or associating it with famous sportsmen like Serena Williams or Roger Federer, Michael Jordan, whatever. Here, the dominant reading would be that if people are buying Nikes to try and get some kind of association with those cool or athletic symbols and trying to, reappropriate that into their own identity, that would be a dominant reading. And negotiated reading might be more something like, I need a pair of shoes to go to the gym. These Nikes are on special. I don't really like Michael Jordan all that much, but they fit, they're comfortable. They're athletic, I like them in that sense, so that's why I buy them. So here there's not just kind of trying to associate yourself, with being cool or athletic. There's some more negotiation, maybe a use-value thing going on there as well. An oppositional reading might be that, as through the late 90s, early 2000s, that Nike got associated with sweatshops, and people started boycotting Nike because of that. So in that sense, if someone was to see a pair of Nikes, the value there, what is being signified, would be sweatshops, and that's obviously anti-ideological reading of that. So in terms of the aberrant coding, it could be that, someone that's never seen a pair of shoes before might ask, why the hell are those things on your feet, or something like that, or they might, see the Nike symbol and, ask why you've got a tick on your shoes or something. There's a more absurdist kind of relation to products then. So that's a kind of way of thinking about this stuff. A key theorist here is Roland Barthes. Barthes was particularly interested into the myths and stories that are embedded into our cultural products. What does the object signify, and why do people desire these things? What are the larger cultural myths do objects embody? Here, consumers become thought of as what's called symbolic technicians. We're kind of going through life consistently negotiating and reading, engaging with signs as a way of making meaning and being in the world. So Barthes' book Mythologies is a particular text here. It's widely read across multiple disciplines. Again, it came out many decades ago, and some of the Some of the objects that he studies in there are a little bit dated. You know, they're old brands of cars. He does a thing on rock and roll wrestling and all kinds of things. But the writing is really beautiful. It's quite poetic. And the analysis, you know, really makes you think about how everyday things and everyday products that we're surrounded by really often have much more meaning attached to them than we often give them credit for. It's also, some of it's quite funny as well, so that's always good when you're reading about this stuff. So, to conclude this week's content, I've touched upon, you know, what it means to be a consumer, and how consumption is going to be thought of in this course in general. I've gone through the foundational works of the Frankfurt School, you know, and just touched upon their key ideas. So certainly, if you're interested in their ideas, seek their works out, and also summarise the work, the ideas of semiotics again, that some of you will be familiar with from earlier courses. So these are kind of, I suppose, the foundational ways to think about consumer culture. And we'll be drawing upon ideas and influences from these throughout the rest of the course. But a lot of the rest of the ideas in the course will also be critically engaging, particularly with the kind of cultural dupe model of what it means to be a consumer. So the course, the first kind of few weeks in particular, touches upon the notion of the consumer itself and different ways to think about how identity is constructed through and with consumer products. And then throughout the second half of the course, we'll move into kind of wider global and production kind of aspects of consumption, I suppose, looking at things like waste, looking at things like how it affects the environment and global inequalities, even looking at the way the kind of the relationship between nature and culture is a key separation in terms of keeping consumer culture going. Okay, thanks.